Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Dennis Shea, and I am the Executive Director of BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. This will be the 10th conversation in our Leaders Speakers series, which intends to spotlight individuals who understand the foundational importance of housing and who have made significant contributions to improving housing affordability in our country. And today we are really thrilled to welcome a very distinguished guest, and that's Mark Calabria, who is the former director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency and currently a senior advisor, to the Cato Institute. As I was reflecting on today's conversation, I came to the conclusion that I can't think of anyone in town, Washington, D.C., who has a greater breadth in housing policy than Mark. An economist by training, he has played an instrumental role over the past 2 decades in shaping housing policy from a variety of different perches. As the HUD Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regulatory Affairs, under President George W. Bush, as a senior aide to the Senate Banking Committee, where he helped craft the Housing and Economic Recovery Act in response to the housing market meltdown in 2008, as chief economist to Vice President Mike Pence, and most recently, of course, as the director of FHFA, the federal agency charged with overseeing Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the federal home loan banks. With the COVID-19 pandemic in full swing, Mark led the agency during a time of unique peril, not only for the mortgage market, but for our country as a whole. And he has detailed his experiences in this terrific book called Shelter from the Storm, which I recommend everyone go on to Amazon.com and get it. But it was really a terrific read. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that earlier in his career, Mark held positions at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, at the National Home Builders, and at the National Association of Realtors. So Mark, really, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Such a pleasure and very kind, generous introduction.
Sure. Well deserved. And but before we dive into our conversation, just let me remind our virtual audience that if you have any questions for our guest, you can post them on our Twitter X account at BPC_bipartisan throughout the event using hashtag BPC Live. You're also welcome to submit your questions in the YouTube chat. So let's just kick things off, Mark. Could you just share, I went through your professional background, but could you share us a little bit more about your personal background and who are your major influences? And when you were a 4th grader daydreaming in class, and I know you were daydreaming, okay, were you like envisioning yourself being an economist and managing an agency, leading an agency?
I mean, I'll say in one sense, in retrospect, it looks like it was planned out, but it really wasn't. It was certainly a lot of path dependency, but a lot of randomness as well. I would say perhaps foremost, not to sound cliche or kind of hokey, but my probably most important influence is my mother. As growing up, my mother spent 20 years working for Fairfax County in the comptroller's office. So, I usually joke both my parents were accountants, and I started out as an accountant undergrad and found out I didn't have enough personality to be an accountant, so I had to switch to economics. No disrespect to the accountants in the room.
The dismal science.
There you go. But it was also, I was kind of brought up with that kind of appreciation for government making a difference, but also a grounding in the numbers have to add up, and you have to have accountability and responsibility, to how it operates. But, for me, a lot of it was, first of all, when I finished undergrad, really was that savings and loan crisis, early 90s jobless recovery. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the reasons I went from undergrad to grad school, was because of the job market. And so for me, it was very impressed upon me in my 20s that the macroeconomic environment in which you start your career in life can have a lot of push on where you end up and where you go. And there was still that aftermath, again, of the housing booms and busts in Texas, New England. So for me, again, I started my career very early, like this stuff happens. And oddly enough, later when I was staff on the banking committee, I would kind of annoy some of my colleagues pre-2008 by giving them savings and loans reading list and say, this stuff happens. We need to think about this.
Right.
And so so for those who kind of like, why is Mark always so pessimistic and dire? Because I've read enough history and know that stuff turns on occasion. So, as you mentioned, I did my PhD in economics at George Mason, really influenced predominantly by Richard Wagner and Bob Tollison, who were on my dissertation committee. And to help put things in context, I really was antitrust industrial organization market structure guy in grad school. And a lot of how I've always thought about finance, mortgage finance, banking is really through a market structure lens. So perhaps it was meant to be that I would have to regulate a duopoly someday. but that was always kind of that lens. And as you mentioned, got my start working first at NAHB, Joint Center, Realtors. It's important to keep in context, I wasn't in the government affairs, not that, love my government affairs friends when I was there, but, I was in the econ shop. I would say, my job at NAHB was trying to tell you what, housing starts in Des Moines next quarter was going to be. And it really was an educational experience for me because I really spent a number of years just learning the housing market. So one piece of advice would be, if you ever want to be a housing analyst, spend a couple of years gaining a working familiarity with the American Housing Survey, or the American Community Survey, and how this relates later. So I'll give you an example. You mentioned one of the other disasters you didn't mention one of the other disasters I was involved with, Katrina.
Okay.
And so I very specifically remember, immediately in the aftermath of Katrina, just, pulling my American Housing Survey off the shelf and doing a back of the envelope in 5 minutes, calculated a damage estimate of my own before I got any data from HUD or FEMA.
How close were you?
I was actually pretty close, and it still stuns me to this day in some sense that, we spent a lot more than the average estimates. In fact, we spent enough to buy every single house in Louisiana and Mississippi. But all that said, and that's the sort of Washington response, I think we probably would have spent more and maybe even less targeted if there hadn't been that data. It was the same thing, and I kind of allude to this a little bit in my book. I remember sitting around my conference table in March 2020 with my chief of staff, John Roscoe, who always made me look good, and my number 2 at FHFA at Alfred Mazzol, and we just started sketching out numbers. Okay, what's the servicing responsibility of GSEs? And the point I want to make is so many of the debates and conversations on a day-to-day basis in Washington are numerical, empirical questions. Yeah, we have the big philosophical fights, but at the end of the day, it's often a question of what's the right number? And I think having spent that time early in my career, being very data-driven, allowed me to come up with a quick number and obviously have staff work out the more detailed numbers and change. Like, for instance, our initial estimate sitting around the table of what we thought servicing responsibilities ended up being much larger than it did as we interacted with staff and got. But again, and also the flip side is, every day in Washington, someone's going to try to put a number by you. Do you have the skill, instincts to figure out whether that number makes sense or not?
Right.
And it also
sniff test.
Exactly. And maybe one of the people who really inspired me when I first worked at NAHB was getting to know Cushion Dolbear, who founded the National Income Housing Coalition. And I'm probably one of the few, one of the people still remember her since she passed away about 20 years ago. But I got to know her through the Housing Statistics Users Group, not through the lobbying, where you're interacting with people who are coming from a very different political perspective, although at that time I would say I don't think I really had a political perspective, but it was really impressed upon me, kind of just rolling your sleeves up and getting into the data.
And then she created the Out of Reach report.
Exactly. And so you would have these kind of conversations where a bunch of data geeks would come around the table and talk about trading, programming. I would certainly say I do not miss spending 8 hours a day, debugging my SAS programs. Those things are far behind me. But having spent that experience, and again, I spent, part of my time at Harvard Joint Center was also being a research associate at Census's, Center for Economic Studies. And so again, learning the data, learning the limitations has really helped me throughout my career. But then again, after the Realtors, I went to the banking committee. And you know, it really was at a time when we worked in a bipartisan manner. I believe the final vote in the Senate on HERO was 84, 83, 84, somewhere in that regard. And it really was influenced by the conversations pre-crisis. And when I thought about when I took over at FHFA, what kind of regulator I wanted to be, I mean, first of all, I started with, I had a long list of complaints in my head as an oversight staffer that annoyed me what other regulators did. And I always said to myself, you know, I'm going to be the regulator that I wanted other regulators to be. And a lot of that was really informed by both Senator Sarbanes and Senator Shelby. Like, to me, Paul Sarbanes really set a standard for the committee in that this is what he thought an arm's length regulator needed to be and how you were supposed to behave and interact with the industry. And, you know, they were on different sides of the aisle, but Senator
Paul
Shelby,
Sarbanes, Democrat from Maryland, Senator Shelby,
and
Republican.
they really saw eye to eye on a lot of these issues, you know, and there was certainly differences and disagreement on topics, and you know, it was and a shame we weren't always able to bridge them, but there was, again, an openness and a camaraderie, you know, and you can kind of understand where the other side was getting at. And again, that was a big influence, you know, on me and how I wanted to be a regulator. But most importantly, I would say one of the things I really took away from my time on the committee when Sarbanes was there, he really liked to repeat that how important he thought it was to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And that was something I've always taken away, that, you know, and you're going to be more able to influence people you disagree with if you are nice about it and polite about it. And so there's a role sometimes, perhaps, you know, throwing bombs. I mean, I worked for Phil Graham for a while too, and I appreciated going down and always fighting the fight. And I also appreciated how do you build a bridge and kind of reach the other side and figure out where they're at.
Okay, we're going to get into your experience as a regulator, but I want to have a couple questions because you know so much about housing policy generally. I mean, I think there's general agreement.
I have lived in a house or several.
Data-driven questions here. General agreement that there's a mismatch between supply and demand, and that has caused housing prices to really soar over the past several years. If you were king for the day, what steps would you take to increase housing supply?
Maybe if
affordable housing.
If I could reset the clock, because let's start with filtering actually works if you let the market work. And remember from my time at the home builders, and I think this number is about correct, that every new house constructed results in about 4 moves on average. And so I know there's often a sense of, you know, boy, not another McMansion. But again, every house you build opens up houses along the chain. So it is important, in my view, that you take a perspective of build all of the above. And if I could reset the clock, what I would really do is how do we get back to a 1965 land use pattern? I mean, this may be a surprise, but for the people who know their data history, 1970, San Francisco was an affordable place to live. It is not today. And you really had the big change in this land use really happened in the 70s and into the 80s. You know, it maybe, you know, I'm generally a fan of Reagan, but you know, when he signed as governor the California Environmental Review Act, it ended up making it far more difficult to build in California after that. And so I think there's a responsible balance. But there really was a time in history when it was easy to build in America. And again, it's within the living memory of some of us, and I think we can get back to that. And it's also important to keep in mind, it's really influenced how we design so many of our housing programs. Much of the 1930s New Deal housing was built in an environment where the diagnosis was weak demand, elastic supply. And obviously, we're in a reverse situation today. And so I do think it takes a whole new set of situations. But again, if I could wave a magic wand, take us back in time, you know, I'm not nostalgic for a whole lot of things other than I guess I'm sad that I missed Woodstock. I wasn't old enough to catch that. But at the same time, if we could go back to that kind of land use flexibility that we had, I mean, I guess I'd put it this way. So obviously, there's a segment of the population where your income is near or at zero, and there is no market you can ever afford. Of course, I'll say on this other side, you don't have money to pay taxes either, so it's not necessarily market failure. But for 90% of the American population, the market is able to supply housing for them if you allow it.
Okay. Let's go to HUD. I know you spent a lot of time on the
As
Hill
we both have at HUD.
and at HUD. You've given a lot of thought to HUD's housing assistance programs. What are one or two reforms that you would suggest to make these programs more effective?
So, in terms of the rental assistance, we've become such a convoluted system where it's not unusual for a multifamily development to have 5, 6, 7, 8 different subsidy streams that all have different funding cycles that you've got to hire different accountants and different lawyers for. I feel like a number of years ago.
This is on the development side?
On the development side. And so how you may have tax credits and you lay your home and then you lay your CDBG and you may begin a state level tax credit and they all have different implementation cycles. And I like the way that I remember then Chairman Barney Frank putting it at one point that his objective, which I don't think he achieved here on some of this housing reform, was how do you put some lawyers out of work? that should be how do we, the simplest way is to block grant a lot of this stuff into one program where there's one application cycle rather than 8 or 6. And then you have one sort of funding stream. So that would be one simpler is how do you combine some of the programs. I think there are things you can do within HUD, and HUD has been making progress over the years in trying to coordinate these cycles. But that's one aspect of it. I am very sympathetic in the public housing realm to more flexibility like moving to work or RAD and seeing more of public housing essentially become project-based Section 8. I think that's the model to go for public housing. I would certainly say, to me, the number one area I'm probably most concerned about is I simply think that we have a lot, I guess put it this way, subprime didn't go away. It went to FHA. And how are we making sure that we should be setting borrowers up for success? And I worry that the marginal FHFA borrow isn't there. So I would want to look at that and try to make sure that we're putting people on a sustainable path to homeownership. While, not surprisingly, I'm not a fan of Dodd-Frank, but the Dodd-Frank Act told FHA, you have to implement your own ability to pay standard. And what did FHA do at the time? Oh, what are we doing already? Okay, that clearly must be the standard. So I think that, again, you and I as both Senate veterans, to me, despite White House running an agency, I am at heart what I call an Article I constitutionalist. And what I mean by that is Congress writes the big rules. And it is your job as a regulator, cabinet secretary, to follow what Congress has written. And obviously there's some area within the lines. But to me, I just don't know how you can say with a straight face that FHA has met its statutory obligations under Dodd-Frank.
Okay, that's a big one. Okay, so let's go back to FHFA. They issued a report last year examining the federal home loan bank system, and it was a significant report. One of the conclusions is that the mission of the banks, of the federal home loan banks, needs to be clarified. And as I understand, they were originally intended to provide mortgage liquidity to member banks after the Great Depression. Have you had an opportunity to look at that report?
Exactly.
What's your assessment of it? And do you think the banks are fulfilling the mission as conceived by Congress?
I think one of the strong things about the report is the history. And, I'll go back and maybe say, if I can skip back to the influences question, when I was in NEHB as a staff economist, I was very fortunate to work for a gentleman, Dave Crow there, who had been in the area for a long time. 9 times out of 10, we would have some policy area come back. And Dave had one of these swivel chairs with the wheels on it, and he would just roll around and reach over to his bookshelf. Oh, Mark, let me pull off this study we did 20 years earlier on this topic because this actually isn't new. So it really—
You find that a lot in town,
yes.
right? Yeah,
so it really impressed upon me at the time 90% of the questions you kind of have in housing have been asked before. And in fact, when in 2008 we did the home buyer tax credit, which I wasn't a fan of because I went and did the research and we did a similar tax credit in the Nixon years, and the research was it didn't actually make a big difference, spiked prices. And again, what happened when we did in 2008? Same thing. But, so the research isn't always necessarily enough to convince policymakers. So again, back to this topic, and I want to parse out something you said. So the Federal Home Loan Bank System was created essentially to be a Federal Reserve for thrifts, savings and loans, because at the time the Federal Reserve was created, thrifts were not allowed to be members. So it really was Federal Reserve, lender of last resort, liquidity provider for thrifts. Obviously, over time, post-savings and loan crisis, a lot of thrifts went away. Congress made this, in my opinion, kind of a Faustian bargain post-savings and loan crisis where they said, okay, thrift industry is insolvent. The Federal Home Loan Bank System, much of it's about to fail. And here's what we're going to do. We'll let you commercial banks into the system, essentially if you kind of wink and nod and agree to pay for the costs of bailing it out. And that was the bargain. Now, what was done at the time was banks coming in had to meet something like the qualified thrift lender test. So you didn't really need, when you created the Federal Home Loan Bank System, to be explicit about a mission because the mission was tied to the membership. To be a thrift meant something at one time, and that governed the mission. And to me, the error was, or rather, the pivot point was when you let commercial banks in, it was only a test on the front end. And that was like in the early 90s. So you could be an institution that might have been a big mortgage lender in 1993, but you're not now. And that's drifted over time. So to me, I guess, again, my Article 1, well, okay, Congress said let them in, so perhaps Congress didn't care what they did after they were in. But I do think that the system has gotten away from its mission because its mission was tied to who its members were, and there was no real redefinition when the membership was expanded. Now, again, perhaps that's what Congress intended, and I do think it's appropriate.
Would you suggest that Congress sort of revisit the membership requirement?
I think it makes a lot of sense because there's simply a redundancy. Like one of the things I think I would take issue with some of the debate is there's often this argument like, well, why are they behaving as a lender of last resort? It's like, well, that's actually what Congress created them to be. Now, if you don't want them to be that, you take that up with Congress. But the Federal Home Loan Banks were not created, in my opinion, to be they weren't created to improve homeownership. There's nowhere in the Bank Act that says you're supposed to target the homeownership rate. They're supposed to provide liquidity in stressed environments for their members. That's what Congress created them to do. Yes, that's the exact same mission as part of the Fed. So Congress has never reconciled that kind of tension there, and the system has found new ways to grow over time. So there are a number of things, and we were doing, before I left, we had started a legal analysis of trying to, put in framework for me, where the Bank Act, I'm going to sound a little biased having drafted part of HERA and fairly familiar with that. Since I wasn't part of the drafting of the Bank Act back in the 30s.
You weren't?
No, I wasn't. Right. I got a little bit of gray, but not quite that much. And so, we hadn't amended it as much over the years. And if you really go back, even though I think the Bank Act is almost more Wilsonian than it is Roosevelt and New Deal, in that, like the Federal Reserve Act, it's short, it's broad, it gives a lot of delegation. When Congress over time, starting in the 30s, got far more detailed about what it wanted from its agencies and regulators. So I certainly think it's worthwhile to revisit the Bank Act. I think there are certainly issues in the system that deserve to be looked at. We had started multiple processes. Like I said, there was an internal process I was there to review the Bank Act. We also, one of the last things I did was started an RFI on compensation issues.
Request for information.
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah.
But request for information on both Fannie, Freddie, as well as bank compensation issues. And I will say as an aside, and I had hoped to visit every bank, but COVID hit, so I think I only made about 5. And it was interesting to me that almost half of my conversations with the boards and the CEOs was all they wanted to talk about was compensation. Of course, what I would say to them is like, listen, I would love a world where I have nothing to do with this, but Congress says it's got to be reasonable and comparable, and I take that serious. And I think one of the fundamental problems is what I inherited as a compensation review practices for the bank was completely ad hoc. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to set up something that was systematic, that I thought met the spirit of and the letter of the law. And I do think that FHFA has a significant amount of authority in compensation issues. So if I had to quibble with something in the report, you don't need Congress to fix the compensation question for the banks. The agency has the authority. The problem, of course, is nobody will be happy with whatever you come up with. But, you know, I mean, again, I think as some of the people in the room can attest, I didn't necessarily feel constrained by making sure everybody was happy with when I did
No,
this.
no. So let's talk about that. I mean, you led the FHFA during a period of real turmoil in our country during the COVID-19 pandemic, and your book details a lot of the challenges you faced and the decisions you made. And could you discuss some of those challenges? I mean, starting with the point that you make in the book that many observers did not seem to understand that you were a safety and soundness regulator.
I think that's probably my biggest frustration kind of with the way FHFA, you know, as somebody who was involved in bringing it to life. There's often this perception that it's, you know, HUD Junior, and it's not. It's if it's anything, you know, you could argue if it's Fed.
Very nice offices.
Correct, and it's certainly very nice pay scale, not HUD's.
Right.
And so it is a financial services regulator, and your first responsibility is that, and then your first responsibility is the safety and soundness of Fannie and Freddie. And for starters, I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that while Fannie and Freddie came very close to failing because of COVID losses, they didn't, and we got them through. But it really was one of those, you know, when you're on an airplane, you put your own oxygen mask on first. And certainly there were, you know, some calls for us basically to sacrifice the safety of Fannie and Freddie for others in the marketplace. And again, that was not the responsibility of the statute and the law. And that's really what we focused on. But we also looked at it that Fannie and Freddie are the fundamental infrastructure in most of the mortgage market. And it's more like, you know, it's a question of keeping the bridge open and going versus, you know, making sure everybody's tires are full, and focusing on the individual players. So again, there were calls for us to essentially take losses. And I think some of this, I mean, it is my view that in 2008, 2009, there were intentional choices to move losses from the big banks on the Fannie and Freddie. I think that's not consistent with statute. I think there was the wrong decision then, and we weren't going to do that. And there is a big theme of the book is, you know, here are the half a dozen things that I think really were gotten wrong in 2008 and why we weren't going to repeat them.
Yeah.
And one of them was we were not going to be Fannie and Freddie were not going to be a dumping ground for the rest of the financial market. This was not a Wall Street dump your trash over here. That was not. We were not going to allow that. The other difference I think was more important really was a focus on borrowers and families first, and then the financial markets or financial institutions second. You know, we all remember the quip about, and coming out of 2008, that the forbearance programs were foam on the runway for the banks. And we were not going to take that approach. We were going to take the approach, how do we help people stay in their homes? Of course, we're in the same environment everybody else is. You know, we don't know what the transition mechanism is. You know, we all remember when you thought you could get COVID from touching a doorknob and these things, and nobody kind of really, there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, we all remember 15 days to flatten the curve. So,
Right.
So again, you know, we were trying to get through, and then also for us, and I think this is one of the real shames in terms of how things are governed and assistance programs. Let's hope that none of us lose our jobs. You know, say for myself, when one is fired and it makes the front page of the Wall Street Journal, there's a little bit of sting to it. But all that said, the real
Badge of honor.
Exactly. The real relevancy here is if you do lose your job and you apply for unemployment insurance, you do not get it right away. It takes you 2, 3, 4 months to get that unemployment check to show up. One of the things I talk about in the book, which I just find insane as kind of a data geek, you may remember 2020, the state of New Jersey put out a call for COBOL programmers because their UI system was a mainframe in the basement that nobody knew how to program. And the relevancy here is the lens through which we were trying to set up forbearance programs was, how do we help somebody get to the bridge of unemployment to unemployment insurance check? And we knew that was going to be a 3 or 4 month period. And that's why
So that was on your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the lens we were going through. And that was why the initial design was we couldn't do a 2008 where it took 6, 7 months to qualify people and get in. Because that initial 3 months is critical for somebody who's lost their job, especially if you might be completely out of work, and again, you're waiting for that check to show up that doesn't initially go up. And obviously many families aren't going to hit those liquidity problems, but some will. And that's what you've got to target on. So to me, speed was really important. And some of this got changed in the CARES Act, which was passed about 3 weeks rather after we started. And our initial plan was we would let you attest to a hardship or a job loss, take you at your word, and then we'd have the servicers go back and call you 3 months later when your UI checks should start showing up, and then start verifying whether you're back on your feet. Congress removed that part of it when they put it in statute, but it really was meant to be get you in, take you at your word. Obviously, we knew there would be some positive amount of people who were lying, but that's a price you pay. There's always, this is again maybe the statistician, always type 1, type 2 errors. You got to balance it, but you can't get rid of both of them, and that's, so you always got to accept that. So we were trying to get people in, and one of the things I think is extremely underappreciated that we did very differently. In post-2008, there was a decision to key mortgage assistance off of your income, and the magic number of 31% was pulled out of a hat somewhere. Maybe somebody knows how they got the 31. And so the way it was set up post-2008, HARP-AMP and these other programs, you got 31 cents of mortgage relief essentially for $1 of earning. Now, of course, the flip side is every additional dollar you earned, you lost 31 cents in mortgage assistance. And that's just the mortgage assistance. You put the tax rates on top of it, you put other means-tested programs. And so you had a huge work disincentive built into the mortgage programs in 2008 that, in my opinion, added to the Great Recession being the weakest job recovery post-World War II. And so I really looked at this and said, and again, my inner economist, I can't create a program that punishes borrowers for going back to work. And so we didn't. We decided rather than means testing, and again, I'm somebody who very much believes you want to prioritize the use of government resources those both need, but we also wanted to set up a program where you didn't lose your program benefits because you went back to work. And I actually think that one of the reasons we had such a strong job recovery in the summer of 2020 was because we didn't punish people for going back to work.
Interesting. One of the themes of your book is the disconnect between the CEOs you interacted with, and you interacted with a lot of them, and their lobbyists in Washington. Could you elaborate? Do you care to elaborate on that?
Well, sure. I'm going to first say, and I do mean this in all sincerity, that
there might be a few here.
That's true. So I think, well, let's just say, I think the first most important principle of leadership is humility. And what I mean by that is you're walking into any situation and you recognize 90% of the relevant facts you don't know. And the question really, to me, in leadership and program design and implementation is, how do you create a system to find out, how to gain knowledge? And it means you've got to go to multiple sources of information. So you got to talk to the lobbyist. I'm a big believer in the First Amendment and your ability to represent your grievances before government.
Right to petition.
And I would say, when I was a staffer on banking, I took every meeting that anybody ever asked for. If Goldman wanted to meet, I met. If Acorn wanted to meet, we met. And again, and I've actually met with Acorn more than I met with Goldman, but we had an open door. And as long as you come and present your case. But that's the caveat. You have to come and present your case. And so I like to think that we ran a very transparent agency, but you also have to find out that, so one of the reasons we immediately started talking to CEOs, many people remember the stress among mortgage servicers. So we had, let's see, in March 2020, I think there was 346 non-bank mortgage servicers that Fannie and Freddie were counterparties with. We had their income statements, we had their balance sheets, but accounting data is always stale. So the first thing we did was, and the servicing industry is rather concentrated, we got on the phone with the largest 30 and said, I'm looking at your balance sheet. What's changed? Where are you today? What has happened? And so part of that was also the flip side of, we were essentially trying to come up with an estimate of capacity in the industry for servicing transfers. So the first question I would ask a CEO is,
transfer servicing rights, obligations from one company.
So after I had them update me on what their balance sheet and income statements looked like, the next question was, how much servicing could you absorb if we needed to transfer from a failed servicer? And we always had an envelope, a measure in our head that we'd put together talking to people. And again, some were very much like, well, I could absorb this, but it's got to be performing if it's non-performing. And so, again, you were getting a good color of what was going on in the front lines of the industry. And so, again, helpful to talk to lobbyists. That's always important. But when you're trying to do something at speed, you have to recognize that lobbyists are intermediaries, and intermediaries increase market efficiency. So I'm not knocking on the role of lobbyists, but if you're trying to get something done today in a pandemic where time matters, you often kind of have to jump over those intermediaries and go with direct relationships. Now, again, the lobbyists would add color and they would give you, and I'm part of this, I worked at 2 trade associations. I understand there's always inter-industry dynamics and who's the member this year and these members versus those members, and you've got to, and you recognize you have to balance those things. So it was never a talk to CEOs, not talk to lobbyists. It was talk to everybody because you're getting different pieces of the puzzle.
And to get the full spectrum of information.
And we spent a lot of time, I mentioned Cushing having for the National Income Housing Coalition. We did calls with the National Income Coalition. We tried to talk to people who were talking to tenants and homeowners on the front lines.
Right.
So again, it's really sort of like, while I have strong sets of principles and beliefs, again, I recognize whatever the situation is, I don't have the data, all the information, and how do I get that?
Now, in Shelter from the Storm, you mentioned, and you've also mentioned it publicly, that elsewhere, that congressional approval is not required to remove Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship where they are now. So what steps would need to be taken to achieve this? And additionally, do you think a second Trump administration would prioritize releasing the GSEs from conservatorship?
So I'll say yes, and then let me go back to the first part of the question. Having been part of the team that drafted HERA and created the conservator and receivership provisions, I mean, we quite literally, plagiarized and marked up sections 11 and 13 of the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. And it really was, I can knock, FDIC sometimes in the way they do things, but there was a very explicit decision to say there is a body of case law around FDIC resolutions, and we wanted to place Fannie and Freddie in that case law because that was precedent set and you wanted predictability. And again, my approach has always been, it's interesting, I mentioned this in the book a little bit, and I highly recommend, read Bob Rubin's biography in An Uncertain World, because it's the opposite perspective from mine. Mm-hmm. And it's very well informed because Rubin talks repeatedly about maximum optionality on the part of the regulator and Treasury. And to me, I actually think this is more one of these Ulysses and Scylla and Charybdis, where you kind of have to bind yourself to the mast to say, if A happens, we're going to do B, because that way you allow market participants to plan for you to do B. The problem with the Bob Rubin world is nobody knows what you're going to do. I mean, I still today don't know why Lehman and Bear were treated differently. And so to me, I just think that it's not just a matter of principle, it's a matter of how do you provide predictability to market participants. And so just like last year, SVB, Signature, First Republic, all of these things went to a process. The process has been criticized for some of them, and that's fine, that's part of government. But ultimately at the end of the day, did Congress vote on Signature? Did Congress vote on First Republic? No. That's the framework we created around Fannie and Freddie, that they would come into a conservatorship or receivership and that the agency would resolve it and put them out. There's nothing in the bill that requires any congressional movement. Now, when we started this process in 2019, as part of going and introducing myself, particularly to members of the House, because we did all of our Senate rounds during the confirmation process. And let me say as an aside, before my hearing, I met with 19 of the 21 members, and even people who were never going to vote for me. It is so critical that you go in there and you hear their. One of the fascinating things is people will often tell you why they won't vote for you, and so you know it coming up in the hearing, so be prepared to answer that.
Right.
And even more importantly, it is human nature that it's even hard for a senator to be nasty and attack somebody that they've had a pleasant conversation with. So do the visits even when you're not going to get the votes, but obviously you're not visiting the House members. So when we were doing the House visits after I got confirmed, we were very up front. It's like, here's what the statute says, here's what we're going to do, and if you, Congress, would like us to do something, I can tell you this is a multi-year process. It'll take us 2 years at least. You will have plenty of time to tell us to do something else, and if you do tell us to do something else, we'll do that because you're Congress. And I would say, not a single member of Congress told me to stop. And in fact, I was astounded, even members on the other side of the aisle who perhaps are known publicly for being a little aggressive. I had one member who's very aggressive Democrat say, Mark, that's so refreshing. I can't remember the last time I've ever heard someone tell me they're just going to follow the law. That's another sad reflection. But, there really was, they were given an opportunity. Now, again, my view was Congress was never going to do anything because I've been up there. It took us 5 years to get here done. And that was only because you had the crisis. So, I think if there is a new administration on the Republican side, that there is a commitment to getting them out. I do want to emphasize it is a multi-year process. So, for instance,
what is the process? What steps would
so
you
let's
need
start
to
with
take without congressional authorization?
when I became director, Secretary Mnuchin reached out to me and said, Mark, we're going to get Congress to create, a limited guarantee on MBS. We're going to get reform for the system. And I said, Stephen, that sounds nice. I don't think it's going to happen, but I will go along with you, and I will go to those meetings, and I will make the case. And we did. And about 8 months later, I think in his mind, he was like, Mark's right. It's not going to happen.
It's kind of a waste of time.
The reason I raise this is unless there's some small chance that Steve Mnuchin comes back as Treasury Secretary, I think the odds are any new Trump Treasury Secretary will go through the same experience of, it's sort of funny in that I know a number of my colleagues, especially at the White House, I think this is true. It almost mirrored, the history of the Clinton administration where you had all of these people come up from Arkansas convinced that nobody in Washington knew what they were doing. And the Trump administration, there was an element of a lot of people coming down from New York convinced that if you were here in Washington, you had no clue what you were doing. And I think my experience was it took about 6 months where, maybe these guys actually know something about how Washington operates. And the point being, Mnuchin went through that with GSE reform. I think any Treasury Secretary, unless they're from D.C. and they're in this world, and even then, there'll be, again, 6 to 9 month process where a new Treasury Secretary figures out Congress is not going to do anything on GSE reform. And I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I think the odds are that's not going to really happen. And so to me, it'd take you 6 months to get a new FHFA director in, it'll take you staffing. So an exit for conservatorship is not a 2025 event. It's more 27, 26. And I'll just wrap up because I know we've got other things we're going to touch on. We went through a lot of options. We went through everything on the shelf. It is completely 100% mechanically doable to get them out of conservatorship by 2027.
Okay, great. Any questions here? I want to just raise your hand, and I think we have a microphone. If you could identify yourself, sir, and ask your question.
Okay. My name's Jim Gray. I'm at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, formerly at FHFA. What really struck me that I want to know about is really a little bit different from the financial system. It more to do with the independence of regulators. So you talked about Sarbanes and Oxley and how they really valued an independent regulator. Apparently you must as well. And we're hearing now, well, of course, and then you sort of suffered a lack of independence when the Supreme Court decision came down about FHFA. And now we're faced with former President Trump talking about maybe even the Federal Reserve should not be independent. So I'm really curious about how you think about whether the Federal Reserve or any of these other agencies should actually be in any way independent from the executive.
It's a great question, Jim, and good to see you again. And that's actually a topic that's covered in my book a little bit, so I'll give you a high level. But I'll start with the observation that the Collins case that decided that the removability language in FHFA, which affected me, I actually wrote that 15 years earlier, so I can blame me. But that said, I did the legal research at the time, and it was well within congressional norms. And I do think it's important for regulators to have a degree of independence. I disagreed with Treasury. One of the things that I found, and DOJ in that regard, one of the things I found very frustrating, and we had asked the solicitor's office to have FHFA give us 10 minutes in front of the court to argue our side of it. And the view, and I get it, if you've ever been in government, you may think if you're an agency that DOJ solicitor is your lawyer that represents you. No. DOJ solicitor takes their own view, and they say that's the government's view, and you're stuck with it. And that's just kind of the way it works, whether you like it or not. So
Well, I just learned something. Now.
so,
Yeah, okay.
and I'm 100% certain that works that way in every administration. And so there is a sense of like frustration on my part at the time that we didn't get to make our case. We were the party most impacted by Collins, and we had no ability to be in front of the court. So I found that extremely frustrating. That said, I mean, first of all, perhaps, given what we're seeing at Treasury and NEC, we need to have a White House and administration independent from the Fed. But in more seriousness, I wrote several years ago, there's such a revolving door between Treasury, White House, and the Fed that I find, equally troubling. So I guess I put it this way. I know people have made a lot of Trump's remarks. I don't know that I've ever seen an independent Federal Reserve in my lifetime. They certainly don't act independent, and they've never acted independent. Now, there's a facade of that we talk about, and you're not going to see, you don't see a day-to-day running of it. But that's, in a sense, is that fundamentally different than you see at DOJ or SCFPB? So again, to me, I'm a bit frustrated. I mean, I was frustrated that President Biden, who is Senator Biden, voted for an independent FHFA and didn't respect that when he could have. We've often left people, FBI, CIA in place. You could have started that tradition and honored the independence of the agency functional. So again, I think one of my general frustrations, I often hear these criticisms of Trump where it's like, oh, he's going to do this. Oh, you mean he's going to do what everybody else has always done in Washington the entire time I've ever been here? Wow, crazy. Maybe you should change it for everybody. So I would challenge this. Those who are concerned about an out-of-control executive branch, I am the first one to sign up for Congress limiting the power of the executive branch. Sign me up.
There you go. Any other questions here? Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Thomas Lopez Pierre, and I manage a real estate private equity fund that invests in the Northeast. It was more of a comment. The gentleman on the left, you mentioned if he was king for the day, what would he want to change? And when he gave his comments, afterwards I looked at the room and I saw the lack of diversity, and I was thinking, well, as a person who's Black and Hispanic and makes up 30% of the nation's population, we would have loved the GI Bill not to have kept out Blacks and Hispanics from getting housing. We would have loved not having predatory lending strip away billions of dollars of Black wealth and Hispanic wealth. Those are the things in housing that we would have been really happy with. So maybe you could talk about maybe how Black people and Hispanic people fit into this housing agenda. Thank you.
I mean, it does go back. A lot of the history of land use is intentionally exclusionary. The land use patterns that we have in this country that have been used at the local level, many times it has been explicitly exclusionary. Often in some places it's been done under the cover of using environmental laws to litigate, but it's often a very exclusionary manner. And certainly the way the programs are created, I mean, I guess you had the FHA created explicitly with the exclusionary restrictions in the 30s. So again, I think you need to unwind all of those things, and you need to be able to unwind them as quickly as you can, and you need to be able to have a system where you are treating borrowers equally, not necessarily discriminating on race. So again, that's a huge problem. I thought it was very helpful when Rothstein's book came out. On one hand, I read it and said, there's nothing original in here, and this is what the research all says. But an importance of books like
Paul Rothstein, The Color of Money.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of a book like that is to popularize what I think is already well known within the community. And obviously, he helped create a conversation with that book that was already well known. I wrote a paper probably 3 years before that book came out on FHFA and cited the discriminatory history of it. So I think you do need to kind of move away from and offset these programs. One thing I will say that concerns me, however, is I'm really concerned, particularly FHFA, with what I see as predatory inclusion, where there's often an argument of, well, you've had discriminatory practices, therefore we need to get rid of DTI and down payment. And this is what got us into 2008, which is setting people up for failure. So there's got to be a balance. It's got to be done the right way. You can't, simply think you can get rid of standards and put people in bad situations. That's how we got there to begin with. But certainly, there's probably no area of public policy that's more driven historically with segregation, discrimination, and housing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I think we have a question up front here.
Yeah. Thanks. Hi, Aaron Cadell from Global Counsel. Good to see you again, Mark. Thanks for organizing this. Wanted to go back to your comments about the potential end of a conservatorship, whether it's under Trump or a future administration, but the one of the issues among several have been just I guess the transitional issues and effectively a restoration of the kind of implicit guarantee. If the entities are returned back to full private ownership, I'd be able to say, well, if as soon as there's another problem again, the government will have to come in and bail them out. So how do you kind of address that situation through have to be some kind of purchase of effectively a kind of catastrophic guarantee from the government by the enterprises? And is that a 2-year phase-in or a 10-year phase-in or what? So just wanted thoughts on that.
Great question. Let's start with the observation that, because this is what I find extremely frustrating in some of these conversations, Congress did not create the implied guarantee. There's nowhere in statute that says we're giving you an implied guarantee. So what is an implied guarantee? An implied guarantee is an assumption by the capital markets that institution X is so important that the government will intervene. So you ask yourself, who here thinks that Citibank would be allowed to go down without the government intervening? I mean, Dodd-Frank says they won't intervene. How credible is that? So part of the fundamental problem is how do you create credibility behind getting rid of implied guarantees? Now, one of the reasons the receivership provisions were put in HERA was to create a process where you could impose losses on creditors. One of the reasons we promulgated a living will for Fannie and Freddie, just as you had for the largest banks, is to create credibility. Now, I'm the first to say it's extremely hard. Maybe I'll leave, since we're wrapping up, leave with this kind of observation. I used to say, and I guess I should preface this with no disrespect to my friends at Citibank or elsewhere, I would regularly say within FHFA, my objective is pretty simple. I simply want Fannie Mae to only be as massively leveraged, mismanaged, and poorly regulated as Citi. All I'm trying to achieve.
Wow. Okay.
Modest goal.
Modest goal.
goals.
Yes. Well, I'm just going to ask the final question, Mark. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for you're a fountain of information. But you've had an amazing career in various different ways, much of it in public service. And so, what advice would you impart to a young person seeking a career like your own in public service, in and out of public service?
Sure. First, I'll repeat some things that were important. A la Senator Sarbanes, you can disagree without being disagreeable. Don't personalize it. The other person's got something to say. Hear them out. The other part of it, maybe consistent with that, is you really should regularly try to repeat your own opinions back to you, structured in a way that's falsifiable. How do you test what you believe? Like I always sort of say, I know half of what I know is wrong, I just don't know which half. So how do you get to that and figure that out? And also—
That's a lot of introspection.
I mean, well, but you got to force yourself to be that way. The other part, again, I mentioned earlier, the kind of having that data or experience. I would almost go as far to say numerical literacy is almost like a superpower in Washington because it's all numbers and many people haven't done the research, and so you need to be able to inform in that way. Again, being open to what other people's perspectives are and knowing that you're missing something. Probably the most important is just communication skills, which of course starts with, if you're not writing and you're not working on things, you should be reading. Read an insane amount is probably the most important. The history of so much of this just comes back around. So learn the history of whatever you're working on, and you'll find 90% of it has repeated, and you can learn that. And of course, I think fundamentally the best way of becoming a good communicator is reading people who are good communicators. And then understanding, lastly, what is your role? I mean, for instance, the moment I was sworn in as FHFA director, I said to myself, during this time, I will give zero thought to whether we should have a Fannie, Freddie, or FHFA, or rather, or the federal loan banks, because that's a question for Congress. My job is to do what they have assigned me to do, and I have enough to do there that I'm not going to waste any time on the stuff that's not my job. And I do think that you see a lot of people in Washington who want to pontificate on everything, and I do a lot of that because I work at a think tank. That's what you do at a think tank. That's not what you do as a regulator. So remember what your job is. And lastly, a really good example of this was, I was in consideration somewhat for a Fed governor job, which obviously Feds are fancy, so everybody looks at them as the best of the regulators. And I really said to myself, I've spent my career in mortgage finance. Where would I make the most difference running FHFA or being a Fed governor where you get cut out of all the meetings because the vice chair and chair are over there not keeping you in the meetings? I said to myself, where can I make a difference? And so my biggest advice to young people starting out is don't always go for what sounds like it's the fanciest title or the higher stature. Think about yourself. What are the skills that you have, and what is the position where you can make the largest impact? And go with that and follow that, and I think you'll have a bigger impact that way. I feel like, FHFA made a far bigger difference than I ever would have made as like a Fed board governor.
Well, that's a great set of advice. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time and this really engaging conversation. I want to thank everyone who joined us here at BPC, and I want to thank our virtual audience for tuning in. I hope everybody watches the BPC website and keeps abreast of future Terwilliger Center events. Do you want to add something?
I just want to add something because I mentioned this a little bit in the book, and it gets me thinking on occasion. I was doing a podcast at one point for someone in the mortgage industry, and at the end of the podcast, they pressed stop, and the podcast was over, and the gentleman said to me, Mark, I want to admit I said some really nasty things about you during the crisis, and I was like, well, I appreciate it. And then he said, and I was wrong, and I want to apologize. And he said, I hope that didn't bother you. And when I said to him, I would rather live in a country where you can openly criticize, even lie about public officials, than live in a country where you couldn't. And I recognize part of the job. And so I want to leave people, it's very easy if you're in a public position to take the criticisms personal. And sometimes they are, but you cannot, you lose the ability, if I wanted to sue everybody for slander every time I thought they lied about me. But again, it's just part of the job.
You weren't being criticized, you weren't doing anything consequential, right?
There is some of that.
Yeah.
There is some of that. So again, the point of if you're going to be in the public eye, you're going to get criticized. Just don't take it seriously and don't get distracted.
Well, I take you seriously, Mark. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and see you next time at the next Terwilliger Center event. Thank you.